In the dim light of a crumbling empire, the once eternal city of Rome falls. The year is 476 AD, and an age of order and civilization comes crashing down around its people. Imagine standing amid marble ruins and deserted forums, wondering what tomorrow will bring. The world you know, with its grand roads, laws, and learning, is disappearing, plunging into uncertainty and chaos. But what happened after Rome fell? How did people carry on when the empire that bound them together was gone? In this video, we'll journey through the tumultuous centuries that followed, an era often called the Dark Ages. It's a story of survival against all odds, a story of war and wanderings, faith and famine, despair and hope. We'll see new kingdoms rising from Rome's ashes, and fearless warriors carving out a future. We'll witness a civilization fighting to be reborn. So, get comfortable and prepare for a 1,500-year adventure through history. This will be a conversational and motivational ride, a human story of resilience in history's darkest hours. Let's dive in and discover how, after Rome fell, people survived the Dark Ages. The fall of Rome. An empire collapses. The Western Roman Empire did not vanish in a single day. It unraveled over years of mounting troubles. By the 5th century, Rome was a shadow of its former glory. Why did Rome fall? Historians point to a perfect storm of crises. The economy was in tatters, constant wars, crippling taxes, and over-reliance on slave labor had stalled innovation. The population had been shrinking for centuries, from an estimated 65 million in the Roman Empire's heyday to about 50 million by 400 AD, a decline of more than 20%. Plagues and food shortages hit hard, and many once bustling cities were shells of themselves. Politically, the empire was fractured by civil wars and power struggles. Emperors rose and fell at the whim of the army, often ruling only months before violent ends. Loyalty to the imperial government waned as corruption spread, and then came the barbarian invasions. For centuries, Rome's legions had held back Germanic tribes pressing on the frontiers, but in the 4th and 5th centuries, those pressures intensified. The fierce Huns surged out of the east, pushing other tribes like dominoes into Roman lands. The Visigoths stormed across the borders, even sacking Rome in 410 AD, a shock that shattered the empire's invincibility. The Vandals followed, plundering Rome again in 455 AD, their very name becoming synonymous with destruction. By 476 AD, the empire was on its knees. That year, a Germanic warlord named Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, a young man ironically named Romulus Augustulus. Odoacer didn't even bother naming himself emperor. He sent the imperial insignia to Constantinople, recognizing the Eastern emperor instead. To the Roman people, this felt like the final curtain. The Western Empire, the mighty realm of Caesar and Augustus, was gone. The fall of Rome was terrifying, but it was also the dawn of a new epoch. As one chronicle ends, many others begin. In the wreckage of empire, medieval Europe was about to be born. Yet in 476, nobody knew that. All they saw was collapse. Provinces abandoned, roads untended, laws unenforced. Roman citizens suddenly found themselves without the protection of Rome's legions or the guidance of its bureaucracy. Chaos reigned. If you were alive then, you might have wondered, is this the end of civilization? In many ways, it was the end of an era, but not the end of the world. Humans are nothing if not adaptable. What followed was a time of trial, yes, but also transformation. New powers would rise from the rubble of Rome, and people would find ways to survive, even thrive, in a changed world. The Dark Ages had begun, a world in chaos. Barbarian Kingdoms Arise. In the immediate aftermath of Rome's fall, the map of Europe was redrawn in blood and ambition. The power vacuum left by Rome's collapse set off a scramble among various peoples, often called barbarians by the Romans, to seize territory and fill the void. It was a world in chaos, but also a world ripe for new leaders. Across former Roman provinces, Germanic chieftains declared themselves kings. Yet, interestingly, they didn't just erase Roman ways. Many tried to inherit Rome's legacy even as they conquered its lands. In Italy, Odoacer ruled briefly, but soon a new king arrived. Theodoric the Great of the Ostrogoths. Leading his people into Italy in 493 AD, Theodoric defeated Odoacer and established an Ostrogothic kingdom on Italian soil. Remarkably, Theodoric attempted to preserve Roman institutions and culture in his realm. He governed as a Roman-style ruler, retaining the Senate in Rome, enforcing Roman laws, and even hiring educated Romans like the philosopher Boethius as advisors. For a time, it seemed possible that Roman civilization might live on under Gothic kings. Meanwhile, across the sea in North Africa, the Vandal kingdom, born after the Vandals had swept through Gaul and Spain to sack Rome, held sway, also using Roman administrative systems in governing. In Spain, the Visigoths established their own kingdom, continuing to issue laws in Latin and uphold elements of Roman law. Far to the north, in the former province of Gaul, modern France, the Franks were on the rise. A warlord named Clovis I united the Frankish tribes and around 486 AD conquered the last Roman rump state in Gaul. Clovis famously converted to Christianity around 496 AD, aligning himself with the Roman Church and gaining the support of Gallo-Roman nobles. By embracing the religion of the former empire, Clovis signaled that the Franks would carry forward parts of the Roman legacy, not destroy it. This blending of Germanic custom with Roman tradition became a hallmark of the new post-Roman kingdoms. However, not all regions had such continuity. In Britannia, the story was much more violent. The Roman legions had withdrawn from Britain around 410 AD, leaving the Romanized Britons to fend for themselves. Almost immediately, waves of invaders, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes from northern Europe, began arriving on British shores. They burned towns and pushed the native Britons to the western fringes, into what we now call Wales and Cornwall. By the late 5th and early 6th centuries, a patchwork of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms was taking shape on English soil. Yet even in this bleak struggle, legends of hope emerged. Chroniclers later told of a great battle around the late 5th century, the Battle of Badon Hill, where the Britons won a miraculous victory that halted the Saxon advance for a generation. Centuries later, this victory was attributed to a mysterious warlord named Arthur, who was said to have led the Britons to glory. Whether Arthur was real or not, the legend gave people a hero to believe in during desperate times, a symbol that even as the world grew dark, heroism and honor could shine through. The reality on the ground, though, was harsh. Most of England fell under Anglo-Saxon rule, and Roman civilization there largely vanished, surviving only in fragmentary memories and ruins. Across Europe, change was the only constant. Kingdoms rose and fell in quick succession. Borders shifted like sand dunes. A Gothic kingdom in Italy might flourish under one strong king, only to disintegrate under a weak successor. The same happened in Spain and elsewhere. Without Rome's unifying rule, Europe became a mosaic of peoples: Goths, Franks, Saxons, Lombards, Burgundians, and more, each carving out their piece of the pie. Yet amid this fragmentation, life went on. Former Roman citizens had to adjust to new masters, new laws, and sometimes new languages. Imagine being a resident of Gaul. One day you pledge loyalty to a distant Roman emperor, and the next you bow to a Frankish king who barely speaks Latin. Or picture a family in Italy, hearing that the Lombards, another Germanic tribe, have invaded in 568 AD, bringing yet another regime to power. Indeed, after Theodoric's Ostrogothic kingdom eventually fell, the Lombards seized much of Italy, and chaos resumed. For ordinary people, these power struggles meant uncertainty. Who would protect you from bandits or enemy raiders if your king was deposed? Who do you pay taxes to this year? The questions were existential. It was as if the ground beneath society was trembling, forcing everyone to find new footing. Life after Rome, survival in a darkening world. With the empire's fall, everyday life in Western Europe slowly transformed. Many aspects of Roman civilization faded or fell into disrepair. Grand cities that once bustled with scholars, merchants, and engineers saw their populations dwindle dramatically. Take Rome itself. Once a million-strong metropolis, it lost hundreds of thousands of residents during the turmoil of the 5th century. The monumental Colosseum and Forum stood quiet. Weeds and wild animals roamed places that had been crowded plazas. In Gaul and Spain, fine Roman villas crumbled as estates were abandoned or seized by new lords. The elaborate Roman road network deteriorated without regular maintenance. Broken bridges were not repaired. Stones were repurposed for new buildings or fortifications. Travel became dangerous as robbers lurked, and no imperial patrols guarded the highways. Commerce, which had tied together distant parts of the empire, shrank to a local scale. Where once ships laden with African grain fed Rome's masses, now villages had to grow their own food or starve. Trade networks unraveled, and many communities became isolated. A farmer might live and die without ever venturing more than a few miles from home, focused entirely on survival, plowing fields, tending chickens, hoping for a good harvest so the family could weather the winter. To survive the Dark Ages, people had to adapt quickly. In the absence of a central authority, local strongmen, whether a former Roman landlord, a barbarian chieftain, or a bishop, became the go-to protectors. These powerful locals offered protection in exchange for service or a share of produce, a precursor to what we later call feudalism. Many free farmers gave up their independence, seeking shelter under the wing of a lord behind the walls of a fortified villa or hill fort. It was safer to be in a community with a warlord to defend it than alone in the countryside when bands of raiders might appear. Over time, free peasants often became serfs, bound to the land, working for a lord in return for protection. This was not yet the full feudal system of knights in shining armor that would solidify in the later Middle Ages, but the seeds were sown in these early centuries when survival meant banding together under strong leadership. Nature, too, seemed to conspire against the survivors. In the year 536 AD, something eerie happened. A strange fog blanketed much of the world, dimming the sun by day. For 18 months, the sun's light was feeble, like the glow of the moon, casting no shadows at noon. Temperatures plummeted. Summer snow was recorded in China, and crops failed across Europe. People starved as harvests withered. This wasn't just a local disaster. It was a global climate shock, likely caused by a massive volcanic eruption in Iceland that filled the sky with ash. The Byzantine historian Procopius wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, and it felt like constant eclipse. A Roman statesman named Cassiodorus described people marveling in terror that they could see no shadows at noon. It was, quite literally, a dark age, a catastrophe so severe that modern scientists call it the late antique Little Ice Age. The misery didn't end there. In 541 AD, as if on cue, a deadly plague erupted, the first pandemic of bubonic plague in recorded history, known as the Plague of Justinian. Sweeping through the Mediterranean world, this plague killed an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the population in the Eastern Roman, Byzantine Empire. Cities like Constantinople were devastated, bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. The plague likely reached Western Europe as well, further decimating communities already weakened by famine. Imagine living in Italy or Gaul at this time. The sun barely shines, crops fail, and now a mysterious illness strikes your village, carrying away family and friends overnight. It must have felt like the apocalypse, Small wonder that many turned to faith, or sometimes superstition, to find meaning and hope amid these calamities. And yet, people persevered. They learned to survive on what they had. If trade couldn't bring Spanish olive oil to Gaul, locals pressed oil from whatever seeds or nuts grew nearby. If a city's aqueduct broke, villagers drew water from rivers and wells. Skills that had been common in Roman times, pottery making, masonry, weaving, became precious lifelines when mass-produced goods were no longer shipped from afar. In some regions, knowledge regressed. For example, the complex art of making multi-story concrete buildings was lost for centuries. But in other areas, new knowledge slowly accumulated. Germanic smiths excelled in metalwork, crafting the swords and plows needed for the new age. The average person's world grew smaller, centered on their village and lord's manor. Life was simpler, but also harsher. A bad harvest could mean starvation. There were no imperial granaries to relieve a famine, no efficient bureaucracy to organize aid. Each community had to fend for itself. These were lean years, and survival often came down to the strength of community bonds and the grace of the seasons. Light in the darkness, the Christian Church. Through all this upheaval, one institution emerged as a beacon of stability and hope: the Christian Church. When the political power of Rome collapsed, the Church was left standing in the rubble, ready to guide and support the people. It's fascinating, almost poetic, that a once persecuted faith became the glue holding society together after Rome's fall. In earlier centuries, Christianity had spread throughout the empire, and by 380 AD, it was declared the state religion of Rome. So when the secular authorities fell apart, many people naturally looked to their faith leaders for direction. Bishops, priests, and monks stepped into roles far beyond the spiritual. They became administrators, healers, diplomats, the shepherds of a scattered flock. In former Roman cities, the bishop often became the de facto leader once the governors were gone. For example, in the city of Rome itself, the Bishop of Rome, whom we now call the Pope, gained immense influence. In the vacuum of power, the popes began asserting their authority as successors of St. Peter, claiming a spiritual primacy over Christendom. Pope Gregory the Great, who led the Church around 590 AD, famously acted both as a religious leader and a civic one. He organized grain distribution to the poor of Rome during famine, repaired the city's walls, and even negotiated peace with the Lombard invaders when no other Roman official could. Across Europe, other bishops did similar things on a smaller scale, caring for the sick, defending towns, and preserving some sense of order. The Church became a rock of refuge in the chaotic sea of the Dark Ages. Equally important were the monks. In those turbulent times, monasteries were like islands of light in an ocean of darkness. Starting in the 6th century, a monk named Benedict of Nursia founded a monastery at Monte Cassino in Italy and wrote a guide for monastic life, the Rule of St. Benedict, that emphasized discipline, prayer, and work. Monasteries following Benedict's rule spread across Europe. These were places where learning, literacy, and the flame of Roman and Greek knowledge were kept alive. In their scriptoria, monks painstakingly copied manuscripts, the Bible, yes, but also the works of classical authors, medical texts, and any useful knowledge they could get. We owe a huge debt to these unsung heroes. By copying and preserving books, the monastic scribes saved critical pieces of Western heritage that might have otherwise been lost forever. Think about it. At a time when war and ignorance destroyed libraries, monks in quiet monasteries in Ireland, Italy, or Frankish lands were busy preserving knowledge for future generations. It's not an exaggeration to say that the Irish monks and others saved civilization, as one popular history book title suggests, by reintroducing learning to Europe later on. The Church also provided unity across fragmented Europe. Even as various kings and warlords fought, most of them gradually embraced Christianity, which gave them and their people a shared identity and set of morals. The conversion of Clovis and the Franks was a landmark. By becoming Christian, Clovis gained the support of the powerful bishops in Gaul and gave his people a unifying faith. Over the next few centuries, missionaries, often sponsored by popes or monastic orders, spread out to convert the remaining pagan tribes. St. Patrick had already brought Christianity to Ireland in the 5th century. In the late 6th century, Pope Gregory sent St. Augustine, not the famous North African theologian, but a missionary of the same name, to England to convert the Anglo-Saxons, and in time even those fierce conquerors became Christians. With each new conversion, Europe gained a bit more cohesion. By around the 8th century, the vast majority of people in Europe, from Ireland to Italy, from Spain to Western Poland, were at least nominally Christian. This common faith was a cultural lifeline. It meant that no matter which kingdom you traveled to, you'd find churches, priests, and familiar religious holidays and rituals. The church spoke Latin in the West, which, even as the common folk stopped speaking it, remained a universal language for the educated and for diplomacy. In a sense, Christianity became the new Roman Empire, not an empire of soldiers and governors, but of priests and monks, with the Pope as its symbolic leader. It wasn't always peaceful or ideal, but it did provide a thread of continuity linking the Dark Ages to the Roman past. It also inspired some new beginnings, for instance, the idea that kings ruled by the grace of God, and that even the mightiest rulers should bow to the divine authority the church represented. This set the stage for the medieval partnership, and sometimes conflict, between church and state that would dominate the Middle Ages. The Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, endures. While the West stumbled through darkness, in the East, the Roman Empire still blazed with light, at least for a time. The Eastern Roman Empire, known to us as the Byzantine Empire, survived and even thrived after the fall of Rome in the West. Its capital was the magnificent city of Constantinople, a true heir to Rome's legacy, perched strategically between Europe and Asia. The Byzantines called themselves Romans until their very end. They preserved Roman law, culture, and administrative systems, and they were the guardians of Hellenistic, Greek, art, and knowledge. If you could travel to Constantinople in, say, 550 AD, you'd find a city of perhaps 500,000 people, filled with grand churches, palaces, and markets that dwarfed anything in Western Europe at the time. While cities like Rome or Paris had maybe tens of thousands of residents in the 6th century, Constantinople was a cosmopolitan metropolis. One of Byzantium's greatest emperors was Justinian I, who reigned in the mid-6th century, 527 to 565 AD. Justinian was determined to revive the glory of Rome. In an extraordinary campaign, his general Belisarius reconquered North Africa from the Vandals, Italy from the Ostrogoths, and parts of Spain. For a fleeting moment, the Mediterranean world saw something it had not in decades. Roman imperial rule, through Byzantium, restored in many former Western territories. The cost was high. Years of war devastated Italy, and not all conquests lasted. But Justinian's ambition underscored that the idea of Rome was not dead. In Rome, the very city that had fallen, Byzantine armies retook it and held it for a while. The citizens hailed Justinian's forces as liberators. To add to his legacy, Justinian undertook an immense project of law reform. He commissioned the Corpus Juris Civilis, or Justinian's Code, which systematically compiled and updated Roman law. This code preserved Rome's legal genius and would later influence law in nearly every European nation. Even today, echoes of Justinian's Code can be found in modern legal systems, a lasting gift from the so-called Dark Ages. Justinian's reign wasn't just war and law books. It was also a time of cultural fluorescence. He sponsored the construction of one of the architectural marvels of the world, Hagia Sophia, an enormous domed cathedral in Constantinople. When it was completed in 537 AD, people were awestruck. It was the largest church ever built, and remained so for nearly 1,000 years. Its colossal dome seemed to hang suspended from heaven by an invisible chain. According to one medieval description, Hagia Sophia's beauty and engineering brilliance symbolized the grandeur of the Byzantine Empire at its height. Byzantium in Justinian's age was wealthy, sophisticated, and powerful, a stark contrast to the impoverished patchwork of kingdoms in the West. However, the East had its struggles too. Justinian's conquests, while impressive, were short-lived. After his death, most of Italy was lost again, this time to the Lombards. The empire faced constant threats: aggressive Persian empires to the east, and later a far greater challenge that we'll discuss soon: the rise of Islam. The plague of Justinian we mentioned earlier hit Constantinople especially hard, killing tens of thousands and weakening the empire at a crucial moment. But unlike the West, the Eastern Empire had the resources and administrative depth to weather these storms for a long time. It evolved into a more compact but resilient state, centered on the Balkans and Anatolia, modern Turkey. Greek gradually replaced Latin as the official language, and the culture became a unique blend of ancient Greek, Roman, and Christian influences. The Byzantines would hold the line of civilization while Western Europe recovered. They gave the West time, centuries of time, to eventually regain stability, and they acted as a shield. When new invaders swept out of the Middle East or Central Asia, it was often Byzantium that faced them first. The empire endured for nearly 1,000 years after the fall of Rome, not collapsing until the Ottoman Turks took Constantinople in 1453. By then, the medieval world had transformed into something new. But throughout the Dark Ages, Byzantium stood as a reminder that Rome's legacy lived on in the East. The rise of Islam, a new power emerges. While Europe struggled in the 6th and 7th centuries, a new power was rising in the Middle East, one that would dramatically reshape the post-Roman world. In the early 7th century, on the Arabian Peninsula, the religion of Islam was born and quickly grew into a vast empire. The story begins with Prophet Muhammad, who, around 610 AD, in the city of Mecca, began receiving revelations that would form the Quran. His message of monotheism and social justice attracted followers but also fierce opposition in pagan Mecca. In 622 AD, Muhammad and his followers made the Hijra, migration, to Medina, where he became both a spiritual and political leader. This event marks year 1 of the Islamic calendar. Within 10 years, Muhammad united much of Arabia under Islam's banner. After Muhammad's death in 632 AD, his successors, the caliphs, carried the message and might of Islam far beyond Arabia. What followed was one of the most astonishing expansions in history. The early caliphs and their armies, fueled by faith and the momentum of uniting tribes, burst out of Arabia. In a single century, Islamic forces conquered the entire Persian Sassanid Empire to the east and took huge swaths of the Byzantine, Eastern Roman Empire's territories. Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, all largely Greek-speaking and part of Byzantium, fell to the Arab Muslim armies. By 711 AD, these forces crossed from North Africa into Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, and defeated the Visigothic kingdom there. In a few years, most of Spain was under Muslim rule, establishing the Umayyad Caliphate in Córdoba. The speed of these conquests was breathtaking. Within roughly 100 years of Muhammad's death, the Islamic Caliphate stretched from the Atlantic coast of Spain all the way to the Indus River in India. It was an empire larger than Rome's had been, forged in an incredibly short time. For Europe, this was earth-shaking news. The Mediterranean, once a Roman lake, was now divided. The southern shores, North Africa and the Middle East, which had been Christian and part of the Roman world, were now under Muslim control. This introduced a powerful new competitor into the equation. Christendom versus Islam became a defining dynamic for centuries to come. At first, many in Europe might have thought the world was truly ending. Invaders from the south, speaking Arabic and professing a new religion, seemed unstoppable. In 732 AD, a Muslim army from Spain pushed into Gaul, Frankish territory. But there, at the Battle of Tours, they were turned back by the Frankish leader Charles Martel. This battle is often highlighted as a critical moment, where the Franks halted the northward advance of Islam in Western Europe. Some later Christian writers dramatically credited it with saving Europe, though historians debate its long-term significance. Still, the reality remained. For the first time in nearly a millennium, Western Europe was cut off from the rest of the Mediterranean world in a fundamental way. Trade across the sea dwindled, piracy increased, and Europe became more insular. The focus of power and wealth shifted. The richest cities in the world were now in the Muslim world, like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba, while Europe's cities were poorer and smaller. Yet this new power also brought opportunities for exchange. Muslim Spain, for example, became a center of learning and culture, far ahead of most of Christian Europe at the time. The Umayyad Caliphate in Spain built libraries, universities, and beautiful architecture in cities like Cordoba and Toledo. They preserved and expanded upon the knowledge of the Greeks and Romans, as well as Persian and Indian science. Later on, Europeans would rediscover much classical knowledge thanks to translations from Arabic. But in the context of the early medieval centuries, the immediate effect of Islam's rise was a further shakeup of the status quo. Europe now faced powerful neighbors to the south and east. The Byzantine Empire fought for its life against Islamic caliphates, losing territory but holding Constantinople. The two great sieges of Constantinople in 674 to 678 and again in 717 to 718, saw the Byzantines heroically repel Arab armies, using, among other things, the secret weapon Greek fire, a kind of ancient flamethrower, to burn enemy ships. Those victories likely prevented an Islamic conquest of Eastern Europe at that time. For the people of Europe, the presence of a competing civilization also sparked a certain self-definition. As the Frankish realm and others became defenders of Christianity against Islamic powers, it gave them a cause that transcended their internal squabbles. This would later culminate in the Crusades, but even in the Dark Ages, you see the beginnings of an idea of Christian Europe versus the Muslim world. Despite hostilities, there was also coexistence. In Spain, for instance, Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived together, not always peacefully, but often productively, for centuries, creating a rich, hybrid culture. So while the birth of Islam brought new conflicts, it also added to the tapestry of the early medieval world, ultimately enriching it in many ways. The Dark Ages weren't entirely dark. There were brilliant lights in the Islamic world that would eventually illuminate Europe too. But at the time, to a monk in France or a peasant in Italy, it may have felt like yet another threat had risen. Another reason to cling to faith and local bonds to survive. The rise of the Franks and the dream of empire. As we move into the 8th century, one kingdom in Western Europe began to stand out as especially powerful and poised to lead the region out of darkness: the Frankish kingdom. We've already met Clovis, the Frankish king who converted to Christianity around 496 and united much of Gaul. After Clovis, his dynasty, the Merovingians, ruled for a while, but over generations they became weak and figurehead rulers. Real power shifted to the officials of the court, especially the mayor of the palace, a position kind of like a prime minister. One such mayor, Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer, effectively ruled the Franks in the early 8th century. He's famous for the Battle of Tours in 732, where he defeated a Muslim raiding force, as mentioned earlier, which earned him fame as the champion of Christendom. Charles Martel's success set the stage for his family, the Carolingians to take full control. His son, Pepin the Short, went a step further. In 751, Pepin made a bold move and deposed the last Merovingian king, getting himself anointed as King of the Franks with the Church's blessing. It was a brilliant political move. Pepin sought and received the Pope's approval for this takeover, establishing that kingship in the Frankish realm now had papal sanction. In return, Pepin helped the Pope by fighting the Lombards in Italy and granting the Pope territory, leading to the creation of the Papal States, lands ruled by the Pope, in central Italy. This alliance between the Frankish monarchy and the papacy was a game-changer. It tied the idea of Western kingship to the Church, and it foreshadowed an even more dramatic partnership soon to come. That brings us to one of the towering figures of the early Middle Ages, Charlemagne. Charlemagne, which means Charles the Great, was Pepin's son, and he became King of the Franks in 768 AD. He would go on to build an empire and earn the title Father of Europe. Charlemagne was a dynamic leader, physically imposing, charismatic, and ferocious in war, yet also a patron of learning and piety. He expanded the Frankish kingdom through a series of relentless campaigns. He conquered the Lombard kingdom in Italy, adding the Iron Crown of Lombardy to his titles. He subdued the Bavarians, and, most gruelingly, he waged a decades-long war against the pagan Saxons in what is now Germany. Charlemagne was determined to Christianize and integrate the Saxons. After many rebellions, he resorted to brutal measures, at one point allegedly executing thousands of Saxon prisoners in a single day. By the 780s, though, he had largely succeeded. His realm spanned from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. It was the largest European realm since the Western Roman Empire, and people wondered if a new Roman Empire had arisen. On Christmas Day in the year 800 AD, that question was answered. In a dramatic ceremony in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne Emperor of the Romans. This act symbolically revived the Western Roman Empire, now in the form of a Frankish Christian empire. The shockwaves of that moment were felt far and wide. In Constantinople, the Byzantine emperor was probably not pleased to hear that a Western barbarian claimed the imperial title, but in the West, it was a moment of pride and revival. Charlemagne's empire, often called the Carolingian Empire, gave people hope that the darkness was lifting, that order, learning, and culture could be restored in the lands of fallen Rome. Under Charlemagne's rule, there was a notable cultural renewal often called the Carolingian Renaissance. Charlemagne was not formally educated. Like many Frankish nobles, he was likely illiterate in youth, but he developed a deep respect for learning and invited scholars from around Europe to his court. He established schools, including one at his capital Aachen, and promoted the standardization of writing. Under his direction, monks developed a clear new script called Carolingian minuscule, the ancestor of the lowercase letters we use today. This made copying texts easier and more legible, facilitating the preservation of knowledge. Charlemagne also reformed the church, pushing for better educated clergy and more uniform religious practices across his empire. The effects of these reforms were significant. Many ancient texts that survive today were copied in Charlemagne's time. It's as if Europe drew a big breath of fresh air. Architecture picked up too. Charlemagne built a beautiful chapel at Aachen inspired by Byzantine models, and art from his reign shows a blend of classical and Germanic elements. Economically, Charlemagne's vast realm enjoyed a degree of internal stability and unity that allowed trade and agriculture to improve. He issued silver coinage used widely, helping trade. People could once again think beyond mere survival. There was an air of possibility. Of course, this bright moment had its limits. After Charlemagne died in 814 AD, his empire didn't last intact. His son Louis the Pious struggled to hold it together, and Louis's sons eventually split the empire in the Treaty of Verdun. 843 AD, dividing it into parts that roughly foreshadow modern France, Germany, and Italy. So the political unity was short-lived. But the idea of a Western empire under a Christian ruler, the idea of Christendom, stuck around. Later on, the title of emperor passed to other rulers, like Otto the Great in 962, forming the Holy Roman Empire. But that's getting ahead of our story. The key point here is that Charlemagne's era proved that the darkness was not forever. It proved that with strong leadership and inspiration, parts of Europe could climb out of the pit of the early Dark Ages into something new. The fact that Charlemagne was crowned emperor suggests people were consciously trying to connect back to Rome's glory, to say, "We remember Rome, and we will build on its foundations." The continuity of the Roman legacy, via the church and revived imperial ideas, was solidified. As we continue, though, we'll see that even as some things improved, new challenges were on the horizon. History never stands still, and the 9th and 10th centuries had their own dose of turmoil to deliver. Feudalism and daily life, a new social order. As the early Middle Ages progressed, a new system of organizing society emerged that would define how people lived and survived: feudalism. We touched on its roots earlier, local lords protecting locals in return for service, but by the 9th and 10th centuries it became more formalized. Feudalism was essentially a network of personal obligations that bound together kings, lords, knights, and peasants in a web of protection and duty. At its core was the concept of the fief, a grant of land from a lord to a vassal. In exchange for that land and the income from it, the vassal promised loyalty and military service to the lord. Picture a pyramid of relationships. At the top, perhaps a king grants large fiefs to great lords, dukes, counts, etc. Those lords, in turn, grant portions of their land to knights, lower nobles, who pledge to fight for their lord. At the base of the pyramid are the peasants, serfs, who work the land and produce the food, supporting the entire structure. In return for their labor and obedience, the peasants are allowed to live on the land and are promised protection from threats. This might sound hierarchical, and it was, but it provided much-needed stability and security in uncertain times. Feudalism really began to flourish as a response to the wave of invasions and threats that we'll discuss in the next section. With kings often too weak or distant to respond quickly, local lords built castles and fortified manor houses. A castle on a hill could watch over the surrounding villages. If danger approached, peasants could seek refuge behind its walls. In return, those peasants owed their lord labor, farming his lands a certain number of days, repairing roads, or paying rent and produce. It was a trade-off: security for service. Knights, the armored horsemen, were the elite warriors of this system. Equipped with chainmail and later plate armor, lances, and war horses, a knight was expensive to maintain, hence the grant of land to support him. Knights were bound by oaths of fealty, swearing loyalty on holy relics or the Bible in elaborate ceremonies of homage. These rituals had a spiritual aspect, often overseen by clergy, which gave feudal obligations a sacred weight. The church taught that loyalty to your lord and a lord's just rule over vassals was part of the divine order. Thus, chivalry and Christian duty intertwined to stabilize society. For the common people, daily life under feudalism was hard but predictable. A typical peasant family lived in a small village of thatch-roofed cottages, surrounded by the fields they worked. They owed certain duties, a portion of their grain to the lord as rent, a couple of chickens at Easter perhaps, and a few days' labor on the lord's domain, his personal land. In return, the lord provided justice, local courts for disputes, and protection from bandits or invaders. If you were a serf, you couldn't easily leave the manor or marry without your lord's permission. You were tied to the land. But you had customary rights too, maybe the right to gather firewood in the lord's forest, or to graze a cow on the common pasture. Life was centered around the agricultural seasons, plowing in spring, harvesting in late summer, gathering wood in autumn, enduring the cold and hunger of winter. Famine was a constant specter. A bad harvest or a band of raiders could mean starvation. Medical knowledge was minimal, so diseases and injuries were often fatal. Yet, there was a resilience in these communities. People found joy in simple things, religious festivals and saints' feast days, where work paused for celebrations, marriages and births, the passing of the seasons. They clung to faith. The local village church was the spiritual heart of the community, and the priest, often himself of peasant stock, would administer the sacraments and offer hope of eternal reward beyond this harsh life. Feudal society was highly local. Most people identified more with their village and lord than any distant kingdom. The roads were still bad, travel was slow, and news spread by wandering peddlers or the occasional official messenger. A person in 9th century France might know little of the world 50 miles away. Yet, ironically, the very invasions and dangers that strengthened feudal ties also ensured that nobody could stay completely isolated. Trouble had a way of finding you. And some people did travel. Pilgrims braved journeys to holy sites. Traders still carried salt, iron, or luxury goods to barter at fairs, and mercenaries roamed seeking employment. Over time, feudalism would evolve and become quite complex, and it differed region to region. England's feudalism was not identical to France's, etc. But as a survival mechanism, it succeeded in knitting the social order together. It gave everyone a place and purpose. King, lord, knight, priest, peasant, each had a role in God's plan, or so it was believed. And indeed, under this system, population and farming slowly began to increase by the late 10th century. Feudalism provided the organizational scaffolding for medieval society to rebuild materially and culturally. Castles and cathedrals started rising, towns gradually re-emerged, all signs that the darkest days might be passing, even though challenges remained. Invasions on all fronts: Vikings, Magyars, and Saracens. Just when Europe might have felt it was finding its footing, new waves of invasions crashed in, testing the resilience of the budding medieval society. The 9th and 10th centuries, roughly 800s and 900s AD, saw a trilogy of external threats: Vikings from the north, Magyars from the east, and Saracens, Muslim raiders, from the south. It was like a second act of the barbarian invasions, and it kept Europe on edge for nearly 200 years. Surviving these trials was no small feat, and the responses to them would shape the map and mindset of Europe for generations. The Vikings were perhaps the most famous or infamous of these invaders. Hailing from Scandinavia, today's Norway, Denmark, Sweden, the Vikings were seafaring warriors, traders, and explorers. In 793 AD, they announced their arrival dramatically by raiding the island monastery of Lindisfarne off England's coast, a terrifying attack that people at the time saw as punishment from God. Thus began the Viking Age. For the next 2 centuries, Viking longships terrorized the coasts and rivers of Europe. They had sleek, fast ships that could navigate oceans and shallow rivers alike, allowing them to strike unexpectedly deep inland. Nowhere near water was safe. Vikings attacked coastal villages, inland towns along rivers like the Seine and Thames, and especially monasteries, which were treasure troves of gold, silver, and food, and had little defense. Charlemagne's descendants, the Frankish kings, struggled to fend them off. Paris itself was besieged by Vikings multiple times, famously in 845 AD, led, according to legend, by the Viking chief Ragnar Lodbrok, and later in 885 AD, when Parisians heroically held out. England was hit even harder. Entire Anglo-Saxon kingdoms fell to Viking onslaughts. By the late 9th century, Vikings, mostly Danes, had conquered northern and eastern England, an area that became known as the Danelaw. the Anglo-Saxons under King Alfred the Great of Wessex managed to resist and eventually make a treaty that saved the southern part of England. But the struggle was existential for them. Imagine being a monk or farmer watching bloodthirsty Northmen with horn-adorned helmets. Though actual Viking helmets didn't have horns, that's a myth. Pouring out of their dragon-headed ships at dawn. It must have been the stuff of nightmares. The Vikings were relentless, but they weren't just raiders. They were also settlers and traders. Many Vikings settled in the lands they raided. They colonized parts of England, Ireland, and Scotland, founded the city of Dublin, settled in northern France. The region called Normandy comes from Northmen, i.e., Vikings, who were granted land there in 911 AD, and even ventured as far as Iceland and Greenland. Viking explorers like Leif Erikson even reached North America around 1000 AD, landing in Newfoundland, which they called Vinland, long before Columbus. The Viking impact on Europe was destructive, yet also transformative. They opened up new trade routes, connecting Europe to the Arctic and even to the Islamic world via Russian rivers. They intermarried and assimilated into local cultures. The Normans of France were basically Viking descendants who became French-speaking Christians, and they left behind legendary sagas that still capture our imagination. From the east came a different threat, the Magyars. The Magyars were nomadic horsemen originally from the Eurasian steppe. Distantly related to the Huns, and modern Hungarians are their descendants. In the late 9th century, they rode into Europe, eventually settling in the Carpathian Basin, present-day Hungary, around 895 AD. But before settling, they spent decades as fearsome raiders. Skilled with the bow on horseback, Magyar raiding parties galloped across the plains of Germany, France, and Italy, plundering wherever they could. Their hit-and-run tactics were very hard for the slower heavy cavalry of Western armies to catch. Some accounts describe Magyar horsemen appearing out of mists in the early morning, their arrows blotting out the sun like a scene out of a nightmare. They raided as far west as Spain and as far south as Byzantine Greece. For people in the 900s, the Magyars were a scourge akin to the earlier Huns. In fact, many thought they were Huns returning. Medieval Latin texts call them Hungari. The Magyars were finally halted by a resurgent German kingdom. At the Battle of Lechfeld in 955 AD, King Otto I of East Francia, Germany, won a decisive victory over a major Magyar raiding army. This battle was a turning point. It effectively ended the Magyar incursions into Western Europe. After this, the Magyars began to settle down and convert to Christianity under their king Saint Stephen, crowned in 1000 AD, founding the Kingdom of Hungary. So a threat turned into a new European nation. But the memory of their raids reinforced the need for strong local defenses, hence more castles and the solidifying of feudal lords who could rally knights to fight such foes. From the south, beyond the ongoing large-scale presence of the Islamic caliphates, there were also frequent Saracen, Muslim raids, especially by sea. Christian Europeans used Saracen as a catch-all term for Muslim Arabs or Moors at the time. Muslim pirates based in North Africa and Spain took advantage of Europe's weakness to attack coastal areas in France, Italy, and the Mediterranean islands. They seized Sicily from the Byzantines in the 9th century. Palermo became a thriving Muslim city for a while, and established bases in places like the southern coast of France and even on Rome's doorstep. In 846 AD, Arab raiders sacked the outskirts of Rome, even looting the tomb of St. Peter and St. Paul, their shrines outside the city walls, which so shocked the Pope that he later built the massive walls around the Vatican that still stand today. Saracen pirates made parts of the Mediterranean a danger zone for Christian shipping. They would capture merchant ships, or worse, take captives to sell as slaves. The word razzia comes from these raids. In Provence, southeast France, a Muslim pirate enclave at La Garde Frenay, Fraxinetum, lasted nearly 90 years, from which raiders harried the surrounding regions and alpine passes. Eventually, local powers, notably the rising naval power of the Italian city-states like Genoa and Pisa, began to counterattack and secure the seas, but not before entire stretches of coast were virtually abandoned out of fear. These invasions were devastating, but in confronting them, Europeans developed stronger political units and defenses. For example, the need to defend against Vikings and Magyars spurred the rise of the Kingdom of England. Alfred the Great and his successors unified the Anglo-Saxons partly to better resist the Danes. And the Holy Roman Empire in Germany. Otto I's victory over the Magyars boosted his stature and led to his imperial coronation. The Capetian dynasty in France, starting in 987, began the slow process of centralizing power, though it would take centuries more. On a local level, as mentioned, castles sprouted and knights banded together. The age of chivalry was incubating in these fights. Culturally, even these attackers left positive marks. Vikings brought new blood and trade links. Muslim contact reintroduced lost knowledge, e.g. translations of ancient texts via Spain. Magyars eventually contributed to the rich tapestry of European peoples. By the late 10th and early 11th centuries, the worst of the raids subsided. Vikings settled or were Christianized. The Normans, the conversion of Scandinavia by 1000 AD. Magyars became Christian Hungarians, and Muslim raids were repelled or limited as European kingdoms grew stronger. It was as if Europe had passed through a fiery trial and come out tougher. The constant external pressure forced communities to organize better and innovate in warfare and governance. The year 1000 AD was approaching, and with it, a sense that perhaps a new dawn was at hand. The Dark Ages were ending, and the High Middle Ages were about to bloom with the building of great cathedrals, the launch of the Crusades, and a general quickening of cultural and economic life. But none of that would have been possible if the peoples of the Dark Ages hadn't first learned to survive and adapt through those long centuries of struggle, of dawn of a new era, from darkness to light. By around the year 1000 AD, Europe stood transformed. What had begun in 476 as a shattered, leaderless world had over 500 tumultuous years coalesced into a new civilization. The Dark Ages, a term often used to describe the early medieval period, were not uniformly dark after all. In hindsight, we can see them as a time of extraordinary change and adaptation. The old Roman world had been broken, but out of its pieces, something new was built. Medieval Europe, a fusion of Roman, Christian, and Germanic elements. As the first millennium ended and the second began, people could look around and recognize that the world of 1000 looked very different from the world of 500. The worst was over, and the seeds planted in the Dark Ages were beginning to bear fruit. Consider some of the changes by 1000 AD. Population was slowly rising again after centuries of stagnation. New agricultural technologies were spreading. The heavy plow in the rich soils of northern Europe, the three-field crop rotation system to maximize output, and better harnesses for horses, leading to more food and thus more people. Where once vast forests and uncultivated lands lay empty, peasants now cleared and farmed new fields. Trade started to revive. Merchant caravans and ships once again carried goods between regions, helped by a relative lull in Viking/Magyar raids and the stabilization of political boundaries. Towns that had shrunk to hamlets began to grow into bustling medieval cities. Places like Venice, trade hub extraordinaire, or Cordoba in Spain, or even places in northern Europe like Ghent or London, all were growing in size and importance. A new middle class of traders and craftsmen was on the rise, especially in Italy and Flanders, foreshadowing the end of feudal isolation. Culturally, Latin Christendom had become the dominant unifying identity in the West. Almost everyone was Christian, and the Church continued to guide daily life, but now it had competition from burgeoning secular monarchies. Kings like England's Ethelred or France's Robert II or Germany's Otto III were trying to strengthen royal authority. Europe was becoming a society of states, not just wandering tribes, and the earliest forms of the nations we know, France, England, Germany, Spain, were coming into focus. Most importantly, Europe had learned the lesson of resilience. The centuries of hardship taught people to adapt and innovate. They learned from their enemies. Knights adopted some tactics of Magyar horsemen and some shipbuilding ideas from Vikings. Europeans also absorbed knowledge from the Islamic world. For instance, by 1000 AD, they had adopted Arab innovations like the astrolabe for navigation, and were about to receive the gift of papermaking and improved mathematics, including the number zero and algebra, via contacts in Spain and Italy. The fusion of cultures, Greco-Roman, Christian, Germanic, Celtic, and now, to some extent, Arabic and Byzantine, created a rich, albeit rough-hewn, cultural fabric. You could say the Dark Ages were like a crucible, where elements melted and merged under intense heat to forge something stronger. By the dawn of the High Middle Ages, around the 11th century, optimism was in the air. Chroniclers of the time note that people expected great things around the year 1000. Some feared the apocalypse, true, but when it didn't happen, it was almost as if Europe collectively sighed in relief and surged forward. Within a few decades, we see a building boom, Romanesque churches sprouting up everywhere, then Gothic cathedrals reaching for the heavens. Universities would be founded in the 12th century, cities would gain charters and self-governance, knights would embark on the First Crusade in 1096, bringing Europe onto the offensive. None of that would be conceivable without the foundations laid in the Dark Ages. Kingdoms like England and France solidified their existence defending against Vikings, as did new entities like Hungary, defending against nomads. The concept of chivalry and knighthood was born from the necessity of mounted warriors protecting the land. The monasteries that preserved knowledge now turned to producing new knowledge. Even literature in local languages began to stir, like the epic Beowulf, composed probably around the 8th to 9th century in Anglo-Saxon England, or songs of heroic deeds in France. Europe's peoples had passed through fire and come out tempered. They had proven that no matter how dire the circumstances, plagues, famines, invasions, political collapse, human determination and community could prevail. In a grand sense, the Dark Ages were a testament to humanity's resilience. These centuries laid the groundwork for the rise of the West. The nations of modern Europe trace their roots to this era of migrations and settlements. The Christian Church, which would go on to sponsor art, science, and exploration, solidified its authority in these times. Many of our basic social structures, parishes, counties, universities, even the idea of knightly honor, were gifts of the medieval world forged after Rome's fall. And, crucially, the knowledge of the ancients was not lost. It survived in dusty monastic libraries and in the vibrant libraries of the Muslim world, to be recovered and built upon later. As we conclude our journey, let's reflect on the people who lived through the Dark Ages. They were not so different from us. They loved their families, feared for their future, hoped for a better life. They woke up each day not knowing if a new disaster would come, but they carried on. They tilled their fields, prayed for peace, defended their homes, and told their children stories of heroes and saints. In doing so, they bridged the gap between the ancient and modern. The next time someone calls the early Middle Ages a dark time, remember the sparks of light we've seen, the courage of a British warrior at Baden Hill, the scholarship of an Irish monk copying a manuscript by candlelight, the vision of a king like Charlemagne trying to educate his people, the steadfast faith of peasants who rebuilt their village for the 5th time after a raid. The Dark Ages were dark, yes, but not without dawn. After Rome fell, people did more than just survive. They adapted, innovated, and paved the way for a new world. Our journey through the Dark Ages shows that even in history's most difficult chapters, the human spirit endures. After Rome fell, It could have been the end of civilization, but instead, it was the beginning of a new one. The fall of an empire gave rise to the strength of ordinary people and new leaders who forged ahead. Kingdoms rose from the ashes, faith united communities, and hard lessons gave birth to innovations. It's a motivational reminder that from great trials can come great transformations. The story of surviving the Dark Ages is ultimately a story of hope, that no matter how dark the night, the dawn will come. If you found this epic tale of resilience and rebirth inspiring, hit the like button and subscribe for more journeys through history's incredible turning points. What part of the Dark Ages fascinated or surprised you the most? Was it the fall of Rome, the fury of the Viking raiders, or the crowning of Charlemagne? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts and continue the conversation. Thank you for watching, and remember, the light we enjoy today was kindled by those who kept hope alive in the dark. Stay curious, and see you in the next adventure.